Every morning in our household, the symphony of daily life began around 6:30. The sun peeked through the curtains, casting a soft glow in the kitchen where I, Sean, would prepare breakfast. The aroma of pancakes sizzling on the griddle mingled with the fresh scent of brewed coffee, a routine I had perfected over the years. My wife, Beth, always joined me in the kitchen, her hair slightly tousled, and a warm smile on her face that could light up the gloomiest of mornings. Our three kids, Ethan, Mia, and Lily, each had their distinct personalities, yet they shared an almost palpable bond. Ethan, our eldest at 12, was the responsible one. He often took it upon himself to help his younger sisters, offering them guidance as they navigated their school projects or when they needed assistance with homework. Mia, at 10, was a burst of energy. She loved to dance and often put on performances for the family, her laughter ringing through the house like music. Little Lily, only 6, was the free spirit of the bunch. Her curious nature and endless questions made every day an adventure, even if it meant searching for her missing shoe or rescuing a ladybug she found in the garden. The mornings were a beautifully chaotic affair. I would call out reminders about the time, while Beth effortlessly juggled packing lunches and ensuring the kids had everything they needed for the day. The sound of little feet racing down the hall, followed by the occasional scuffle over who would sit where at the breakfast table, made our home feel alive and full of love. We encouraged each child to express themselves, whether through art, sports, or academics, nurturing their passions as best as we could. After breakfast, we would pile into our old minivan, a relic of our busy family life, but it served its purpose well. It was our rolling sanctuary, filled with backpacks, lunchboxes, and the sounds of the kids debating who would control the radio. On the drive to school, we'd share stories about what lay ahead in the day, Ethan's upcoming soccer match, Mia's dance recital, and Lily's kindergarten art project. We made it a point to listen to each other, reinforcing the idea that every voice in our family mattered. Family dinners were another cherished tradition. Each evening, we gathered around the table, sharing not only meals but our triumphs and tribulations of the day. Beth would often prepare our favorites, lasagna, grilled chicken, or her famous tacos, while I would help set the table and pour drinks. As we ate, the conversations flowed. Sometimes animated and filled with laughter, other times more subdued, but always filled with love. We would ask each child about their day, encouraging them to speak freely. It was in these moments that we created a strong foundation of trust and support. Weekends were a bit more relaxed but equally busy. We often spent Saturdays exploring local parks, attending Ethan's soccer games, or having movie marathons at home. Beth had a knack for making every outing feel special, often packing snacks for our adventures. It was her way of infusing joy into our lives, reminding us that the little things mattered. Our Sundays were typically reserved for chores and preparing for the week ahead, but we always carved out time for family board games or a lazy afternoon in the backyard, basking in the sun while sharing stories. Despite the hustle and bustle, we thrived on teamwork and communication. We often held family meetings to discuss upcoming events or any issues that might arise, ensuring everyone had a say. Beth and I worked hard to create a nurturing environment, where our children felt safe to express themselves without fear of judgment. Our home was a sanctuary, a space where love and laughter reigned, a place we had carefully built together over the years. As we moved through our daily routines, the warmth of our family life cocooned us. We were a unit, each member playing a vital role in the collective happiness we shared. Little did I know, however, that beneath the surface of this idyllic existence, a storm was brewing, one that would shatter the very foundation we had worked so hard to build. But for now, in those early mornings filled with laughter and chaos, I held on to the belief that our family was unbreakable, blissfully unaware of the trials that lay ahead. At first, it was nothing more than a small shift in our routine, something so subtle that I barely noticed it. Beth had always been incredibly dedicated to her work as a teacher. She loved her job, and I admired her for the passion she brought to it. But over the years, we had fallen into a comfortable rhythm where work and home were balanced. However, that balance began to tip, and it all started with those late nights. It wasn't unusual for Beth to bring work home, a pile of essays to grade or lesson plans to tweak. But suddenly, it seemed like she was spending more and more time at school after hours. "I have a parent-teacher meeting," she would say, or "we're preparing for the school play." At first, I didn't think much of it. Teaching could be demanding, especially with extracurricular activities ramping up toward the end of the school year. But when the late nights started becoming a regular occurrence, a nagging sense of unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach. I remember one evening in particular. It was a Friday, and Beth was supposed to be home by 6. The kids and I had already eaten dinner, spaghetti, their favorite. I had put Lily to bed and was tucking Mia and Ethan in when I realized Beth still hadn't called or texted to say she'd be late. It wasn't like her to be out of touch, especially when it came to the kids. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe her phone had died, or she got caught up in a meeting. But as the clock ticked closer to 10, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When she finally walked through the door that night, her face looked different, distant, almost like she had been somewhere else entirely. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Beth nodded and offered a tired smile. But it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, there was just so much to get through," she replied, brushing past me to head upstairs. Her usual warmth and the small affectionate gestures we shared, like a kiss on the cheek or a quick embrace, were missing. It was as if an invisible wall had sprung up between us, and I couldn't understand why. Over the next few weeks, the changes in Beth became more pronounced. She started dressing differently, nothing too dramatic, but her outfits for work became more polished. More put together than usual. I noticed new blouses hanging in her closet, items I hadn't seen before. She took extra time getting ready in the mornings, carefully applying makeup and styling her hair. It wasn't like her to be so meticulous, especially on ordinary school days. Her phone became another source of tension. Beth had always been open with her phone, leaving it on the counter or tossing it onto the bed without a second thought. But now, it was constantly with her, either in her hand or tucked away in her bag. I'd catch her glancing at it more often than usual, sometimes smiling slightly before quickly tucking it away. When I asked who she was texting, she'd brush it off, saying it was work-related or one of the teachers from school. But something about her response felt off, as if she was hiding something beneath the surface. Our conversations started to change, too. Beth had always been open about her day, sharing funny anecdotes about her students or venting about the challenges she faced. But lately, she had grown quieter, more reserved. When I'd ask her how her day went, she'd give me short, vague answers. It was fine, she'd say, or nothing too exciting. I noticed she stopped telling me specific stories. Things she used to share with ease now seemed off limits, like she was holding parts of herself back. One evening, after another long day of waiting for her to come home, I tried to press her for more details. "You've been staying late a lot lately," I said, doing my best to keep my voice even. "Is everything okay at work?" Beth hesitated, her fingers brushing through her hair as she avoided eye contact. "Yeah, just a lot going on with the school play and some extra meetings," she said, her voice a little too casual. "It's nothing to worry about." But I was worried. I could feel a growing distance between us, a gap that I couldn't seem to close. It wasn't just her late nights or her guarded demeanor. It was something deeper, something unspoken, like a shadow that had crept into our marriage without me noticing. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started, but I knew that the woman I had shared my life with for years was slipping away from me, bit by bit. I found myself replaying small moments in my head, trying to figure out if there had been signs I had missed earlier. The way she would sometimes drift off during our family dinners, barely engaging in conversation. Or the nights when she would come to bed later than usual, claiming she had more work to finish, yet I could sense she was emotionally elsewhere. There were times when I'd reach out to hold her, and she'd gently pull away, saying she was tired. It was subtle, but over time, these moments piled up, leaving me with a growing sense of dread. The worst part was that I didn't know how to confront her. I didn't want to accuse her of something that wasn't there. What if I was just overthinking it? But I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that our marriage was changing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I began to wonder if I had done something wrong, something to push her away. Was it me? Was it the pressures of family life? Or was it someone else? As the days passed, that unease turned into suspicion. I couldn't help but notice that Beth seemed more excited about going to work than she had in years. She spoke about her colleagues in a different tone, particularly one of the other teachers, though she never mentioned him by name. But my instincts were telling me that something was wrong. Something was happening beyond the walls of our home. And it felt like I was the last person to know. The walls between us were growing taller, and I was left on the outside, trying to figure out what was going on in the shadows of her new, secretive world. It was a Friday evening when my friend Jake casually dropped the bombshell. We were sitting at a local bar, catching up after weeks of barely having any time to meet. Jake had been one of my closest friends for years, the kind of guy who always seemed to know everything that was happening in our small town. We'd been talking about work, the kids, and life in general when he suddenly paused, hesitating as if weighing whether to continue. "Sean, listen, I don't know how to bring this up, and maybe it's nothing, but..." Jake trailed off, taking a sip of his beer before setting the glass down carefully. I could see the conflict in his eyes, and my stomach tightened in response, already sensing that whatever he was about to say wouldn't be good. "What is it?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady even as a cold sense of dread crept up my spine. Jake sighed and glanced around as if checking to make sure no one else could hear. "I was at the school last week, picking up my nephew, and I saw Beth. She was with that new guy, Mr. Daniels, one of the teachers. They were sitting in her car, talking, but it didn't look like a typical work conversation, you know. They seemed close." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying at first. Beth? In her car with a colleague? My mind raced, trying to fit this new information into the puzzle of late nights and distant conversations. Jake must have noticed the change in my expression because he quickly added, "Look, man, it could be nothing. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. But it just didn't sit right with me, so I thought you should know." For a moment, I didn't respond. The bar around us faded into a distant hum as I tried to wrap my head around what he was implying. Beth had always been professional, always drawing clear lines between work and personal life. The idea that she could be, what? Flirting? Having an affair? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I forced a laugh, though it came out more strained than I intended. "Nah, Beth wouldn't do something like that. She's probably just stressed from work. You know how it is this time of year." But even as I said the words, they felt hollow. There had been too many little things adding up lately, her constant phone use, the late nights, the distance between us. And now this. Jake didn't push it, just nodded slowly and gave me a sympathetic look. "Yeah, man, maybe you're right. Just wanted to give you a heads up. But the damage had been done." His words lodged themselves deep in my mind, replaying over and over like a loop I couldn't escape. By the time I left the bar that night, my thoughts were a chaotic storm of doubt, anger, and confusion. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the image of Beth and Mr. Daniels sitting in her car. Jake's words gnawed at me, eroding the trust I had once taken for granted. I tried to act normal around Beth, but every time she came home late or brushed off my questions about her day. The suspicion grew stronger. I felt like I was living in a fog, caught between wanting to confront her and fearing what I might uncover if I did. It was late one night, after the kids were already in bed, that I finally reached my breaking point. Beth was upstairs, asleep, her phone charging on the nightstand beside her. I had never been the type to invade her privacy, and the thought of going through her phone made me feel sick, but the doubt had become unbearable. I needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. Quietly, I crept into our bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The soft glow of her phone screen lit up as I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. I hesitated, staring at the lock screen, debating whether to go through with it. But then I remembered Jake's words, the image of Beth and that teacher lingering in my mind like a haunting echo. With a deep breath, I unlocked the phone and began scrolling through her messages. At first, everything seemed normal, chats with friends, and conversations about work, but then I found it. A long thread with Mr. Daniels buried deeper in the list. My heart sank as I opened it, and the words on the screen made my blood run cold. The conversation wasn't innocent. It started professional enough, discussions about school events, students, lesson plans. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. Flirty remarks, inside jokes that I didn't understand, little comments that hinted at something more. And then, further down, the damning evidence. "I can't stop thinking about last night. It felt so right being with you." My stomach lurched as I stared at the screen, the room spinning around me. There it was, in black and white, the confirmation I had been dreading. The messages between Beth and Mr. Daniels were undeniable. They had met outside of work, they had shared moments, and from the looks of it, those moments had crossed the line from professional to personal in a way that shattered every ounce of trust I had in her. I kept scrolling, My fingers moving faster now, almost frantic as I searched for some kind of explanation, some justification that could make sense of this betrayal. But it only got worse. There were plans to meet again, hints of stolen kisses, talk of how they had to be careful so no one at school would find out. I felt like I was going to be sick. Yanking myself away from the phone, I stumbled back into the hallway, my hands shaking and my breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of what I had just discovered hit me like a tidal wave. And I collapsed onto the floor, my back pressed against the wall as tears welled up in my eyes. How could she do this? How could Beth, the woman I had built my life with, the mother of our children, betray me like this? Anger and pain surged through me, intertwining into something unbearable. I felt a burning rage toward both of them, Beth, for lying to me, and Mr. Daniels, for daring to intrude on my family. I wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers. But at the same time, I was paralyzed by fear. Fear of what this meant for our family, fear of what would happen to the kids, fear of the reality that my marriage might be beyond saving. For hours, I sat there in the dark, torn between heartbreak and fury, my mind racing through every possible scenario. My world had just crumbled, and I didn't know how, or if, it could ever be put back together again. The anger didn't fade. If anything, it grew with each passing day. Every time I saw Beth, the betrayal stung like a fresh wound. I could barely look at her without seeing those messages, the lies, and the stolen moments with Mr. Daniels playing over and over in my mind. She moved around the house as if everything was normal, smiling at the kids, and making small talk with me. It was infuriating. How could she carry on like nothing had changed? Like she hadn't ripped our life apart? That's when the idea first took root. I couldn't just sit back and let her get away with this. She'd destroyed my trust, our marriage, everything we had built over the years. But this wasn't just about me. It was about the kids, about our family, about the life we had worked so hard to build. And Mr. Daniels? That smug bastard had no right to come into my world and tear it apart. No, I wasn't going to take this quietly. I needed to do something that would hurt them both, something that would show her what it felt like to be humiliated, to be broken. Beth had built her life around her reputation, the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the respected member of the community. I was going to take all of that away from her, just like she had taken away my peace. That's when the plan started to form in my head. The school was holding its annual spring fundraiser in a few weeks. It was always a big deal. Parents, teachers, and local officials would be there, all coming together to raise money for the school programs. Beth had been involved in organizing it for years, always so proud of the work she did. She had a role in the event every year, speaking, coordinating the silent auction, and shaking hands with the principal and the PTA members. Everyone admired her. They saw her as this perfect, reliable woman. But they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know she was living a lie. I decided that would be the stage for my revenge. Public, brutal, unforgettable. If I could expose her at the event, in front of everyone she valued and respected, it would be the perfect way to destroy her image. I'd make sure the entire community knew the truth about who she was. But this wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. No, I needed to be smart about this. Precise. I couldn't just scream out accusations and hope people believed me. I needed proof, something undeniable. And I needed to do it in a way that left no doubt in anyone's mind about her guilt. Over the next few days, I spent hours planning. I started collecting every bit of information I could find. I took screenshots of the texts between Beth and Mr. Daniels, keeping them hidden in a secure folder on my computer. I considered hiring a private investigator to dig up more details. But that felt too extreme, even for me. The texts were damning enough, I decided. But I couldn't just throw them out in front of everyone without building a narrative first. I spent nights rehearsing what I would say. I imagined how the event would unfold. Beth would be standing up front, smiling, accepting praise for her work. And then, I'd stand up, calm and collected, and start asking questions. I would talk about trust, loyalty, and the sanctity of family. I would make the crowd sympathize with me first. I had to make sure the other parents, the teachers, and even the principal were on my side before I revealed the truth. And then, at the perfect moment, I'd show them. The texts, the proof. I could already see the shock on their faces, the whispers spreading through the room like wildfire. Beth would be standing there, exposed, with no way to deny it. I smiled bitterly to myself every time I imagined it. It would be her downfall. The perfect revenge. Once the plan was set in my mind, I knew I had to begin preparing for the event in earnest. The school fundraiser wasn't just a casual gathering, it was a carefully orchestrated affair that required weeks of planning. I couldn't afford to look like I was just showing up for my vendetta. I needed to be deeply involved, making connections and gaining trust, so that when the moment came, no one would question my motives. I began attending every meeting related to the event. PTA meetings, planning sessions, and even informal gatherings of parents at the local coffee shop. I made sure to offer my help wherever I could, making myself indispensable to the team. I volunteered to handle the logistics of setting up the silent auction, organizing the seating arrangements, and coordinating with vendors. It was tedious work, but every interaction was a piece of the puzzle. The more I integrated myself into the event, the more people saw me as a committed father, dedicated to the school and the community. The other parents started to warm to me in a way they hadn't before. Maybe they pitied me. After all, Beth had been distant. And I think some of them noticed. I let slip, ever so subtly, that things at home weren't perfect. Nothing too direct, just enough to plant the seed of doubt. I mentioned how busy Beth had been lately, how she was always at the school, how we barely had time together anymore. People nodded sympathetically. It was all part of the plan. But I wasn't just focused on winning over the parents. I knew I needed to cultivate relationships with the teachers and staff as well. They were the key to making the night run smoothly. I started having casual conversations with the teachers, dropping by after school to discuss the event. I spoke to the principal, offering to handle last-minute tasks, anything to put myself in a good light. Everyone needed to see me as a reliable, supportive husband and father so that when the time came, my words would carry more weight than hers. Beth, of course, had no idea what was happening. She was too busy with her own life to notice how involved I had become. Every night, she came home exhausted, spending hours on her phone, catching up on school emails and messaging her colleagues. I wondered how often those messages included Mr. Daniels. But I didn't confront her. I didn't let on that anything was different. I needed her to be completely unaware of what was coming. As the day of the fundraiser drew closer, I could feel the tension building. Everything was in place. The event was planned to perfection, and my role was secured. I had gathered all the evidence I needed and rehearsed my speech in my mind 100 times. The stage was set. All that was left was to wait for the moment when I could pull the trigger and watch everything crumble around her. Beth wouldn't see it coming. Neither would Mr. Daniels. And when it was over, they would be the ones left to pick up the pieces of their shattered reputations, while I stood in the wreckage of the life they had destroyed. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking control of my life again. It was about making sure that Beth felt the same pain and humiliation that I had been forced to endure. The day of the fundraiser arrived with a weight that pressed heavily on my chest from the moment I woke up. The house was quiet that morning, but the tension between Beth and me felt more suffocating than ever. She moved through her routine, making breakfast for the kids, chatting about the event that night, as if everything was fine. As if her world hadn't already crumbled in my eyes. I watched her closely as she went about her day, studying every little movement, every smile she gave the children, every glance she threw my way. She had no idea what was coming. The thought gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction, but also a nervous pit in my stomach. This was it, the culmination of weeks of planning, of simmering anger and hurt. Tonight, everything would unravel for her. I spent the day preparing, but not in the way the other parents and organizers did. I wasn't focused on auction items or seating charts. My mind was entirely consumed with the moment that was fast approaching, the moment when I would walk up on stage, look out over the faces of our friends, neighbors, teachers, and parents, and drop the bomb that would explode Beth's carefully curated image into pieces. I rehearsed it over and over in my mind. The speech, the evidence, the reactions. I pictured Beth standing among the crowd, her face slowly draining of color as she realized what was happening. I envisioned Mr. Daniels, probably sitting there with a self-satisfied smirk, which would disappear the moment he understood that he was being exposed to. The thought of wiping those smug looks off their faces kept me focused, even as doubt and nerves crept into my mind. What if this didn't go as planned? What if people didn't believe me? What if this backfired and I was left standing there, humiliated instead of her? But I couldn't let myself think that way. I had come too far. The tension, the lies, the betrayal, I needed this release. I deserved this release. The evening began like any other school fundraiser. Parents and teachers milled around the auditorium, chatting politely, bidding on silent auction items, and sipping cheap wine from plastic cups. The atmosphere was buzzing with the usual excitement, but for me, it felt like the calm before the storm. Every time I caught sight of Beth across the room, laughing with another parent or smiling at a teacher, the knot of rage in my stomach tightened. She looked so confident, so sure of herself, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. It was infuriating. She wore her usual polished, effortless look, hair perfectly styled, makeup done just right. To everyone else, she was still the picture of a devoted, hardworking mother and wife. But I knew the truth, and that truth burned inside me like a fire I couldn't contain. As the evening progressed, I could feel my nerves building. There was a moment when I wondered if I could go through with it. Could I stand up there and destroy her in front of all these people? Could I put our entire life on display for everyone to see? But then I remembered the messages. The lies. The nights she came home late, reeking of betrayal. That anger pushed the doubt aside. I was ready. Finally, the moment arrived. The principal took the stage to thank everyone for coming and to speak about the success of the fundraiser. It was the perfect lead-in for me. My heart was racing as I stood near the back of the room, waiting for my opportunity. The principal spoke for a few minutes, thanking the parents and teachers for their hard work. I could barely hear her over the pounding in my chest. All I could focus on was Beth, who was standing near the front, beaming with pride as the principal called her name, praising her for her contributions to the event. It was time. I made my way to the front, catching the eye of the principal, who gave me a puzzled look as I approached the microphone. I cleared my throat, and the room fell quiet, all eyes turning toward me. Beth's smile faltered slightly when she saw me stepping up to the stage, but she didn't seem to think much of it. Not yet. I'd like to say a few words, I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I could feel the tension in the room shift, a ripple of confusion spreading through the crowd. This wasn't planned. People weren't expecting me to speak. I glanced at Beth, who was watching me with a curious expression. I want to talk about trust, I continued, my voice rising just enough to catch everyone's attention. About loyalty. About what it means to truly be there for the people you love. Beth's brow furrowed slightly, a look of unease creeping across her face. Good. She was starting to sense that something was off. We all come here tonight to support our kids, our families, and our community, I said, scanning the room. We trust each other to do the right thing. To be honest. To be faithful. I could see the confusion deepening in the faces of the crowd, whispers starting to spread as people exchanged glances. I felt the rush of power surge through me. This was it. But sometimes, I said, my voice sharpening, that trust is broken. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out my phone. My hands were shaking slightly, but I steadied myself. And tonight, I want to share with you all just how that trust can be shattered. The room went dead silent. I looked directly at Beth now, her face pale as she stared at me, eyes wide. She knew what was coming. I tapped on my phone, pulling up the screenshots I had saved. I raised the phone slightly as if presenting evidence to a courtroom. Some of you may not know this, but for the past few months, Beth, my wife, has been having an affair with a teacher at this very school. Gasps echoed through the room, and I saw Beth stagger backward, her face draining of all color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The shock, the panic, the horror, it was all written across her face. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. She's been lying to me, to our children, and to all of you. And I have the proof. With a quick motion, I began scrolling through the texts, reading aloud the damning messages. I can't stop thinking about last night. It felt so right being with you, I recited, my voice cutting through the stunned silence like a knife. The room was in chaos now. People were whispering, some gasping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I could see Mr. Daniels in the crowd, his face ashen, trying to shrink into the background. But it was too late. Everyone knew. Beth stood frozen, her hands trembling, her face a mask of disbelief and shame. She looked like she wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to run. The entire room was staring at her, judging her, condemning her. And I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The hurt, the rage, the betrayal. It had all been laid bare for everyone to see. Beth's perfect world had just crumbled in front of everyone she had fooled. In the days that followed the fundraiser, the fallout was worse than I had imagined. At first, there was an eerie quiet, almost as if the world around us was holding its breath. I went to bed that night with the rush of adrenaline still coursing through my veins, feeling the strange satisfaction of having exposed Beth for who she truly was. But that feeling didn't last. The silence that settled over the house the next morning was deafening. It wasn't the peaceful, everyday quiet I was used to. It was the silence of a life that had been shattered. Beth didn't speak to me. She barely even looked at me. She walked around the house like a ghost. Her face pale and drawn, her eyes rimmed with red. I knew she had been crying, probably alone in the bathroom, trying to pull herself together for the kids. But she couldn't hide it. She was broken. And for a brief moment, I felt the twisted satisfaction that I had wanted. She deserved this, after what she had done to us, to me. But it wasn't just Beth who had to face the consequences of that night. The fallout spread much further than I had anticipated. The first signs came when I dropped the kids off at school. The whispers started almost immediately as I walked through the hallways. Parents glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Some whispered to each other as I passed, their eyes full of judgment. I could feel the weight of their stares, the pity in their eyes. They weren't just talking about Beth. They were talking about me. About us. Our family had become the subject of gossip. I had thought that by exposing Beth, I'd shift all the blame onto her. But now, I realized that people weren't seeing it that way. I overheard someone saying, "I can't believe he did that in front of everyone," and suddenly it hit me. This wasn't just her humiliation. It was ours. I had dragged our private pain into the spotlight for everyone to see, and now our entire family was under scrutiny. Beth, of course, faced the brunt of it. She lost her footing in the community almost overnight. The parents who used to greet her warmly at drop-offs and pickups now avoided her, offering only stiff nods or awkward glances. I saw the change in the teachers' eyes, too. They didn't greet her with the same warmth. And the PTA? The committee she had been so proud to be a part of? She was effectively shut out. The invitations to coffee, to meetings, to casual gatherings, they all dried up. She had become an outcast. At work, it was even worse for her. Teachers whispered in the break room. Students' parents, no doubt having heard the rumors, stopped communicating with her as openly. I could see it in her demeanor when she came home, how she was shrinking under the weight of it all. This wasn't the confident, self-assured Beth I had once known. This was a woman who had lost everything that mattered to her. But as much as I had wanted her to feel that pain, to understand the hurt she had caused me, the victory began to taste bitter. Because it wasn't just Beth who was suffering. Our children became the collateral damage. I didn't think about how much they would be affected. I thought I was just tearing down Beth's reputation, but the wreckage spread far beyond her. At school, the kids started to notice the change in how other parents and teachers treated them. I remember one afternoon when my youngest, Sarah, came home from school unusually quiet. She usually loved to chatter about her day, but that day, she just shrugged when I asked her how it had gone. When I pressed her, she finally mumbled, "Some of the kids, they were saying things about Mom. And about you." The weight of those words hit me like a punch in the gut. It wasn't just Beth's reputation that had crumbled, it was ours. It was theirs. Our children, completely innocent in all of this, were being dragged into the fallout. They were the ones who had to face the whispers and the judgment of their peers. They didn't understand why everything had changed, why the parents who used to smile at them now whispered behind their backs. I saw it in my eldest, too. Jake, who had always been so resilient, so strong, started to retreat into himself. He avoided eye contact and stayed in his room more, barely speaking at the dinner table. He was a teenager, he knew more than the younger ones. He understood, in his way, what had happened, but he didn't talk about it. He didn't need to. I could see the anger and confusion in his eyes. The guilt began to creep in slowly, like a dark cloud over everything. I had been so consumed with my need for revenge, for justice, that I hadn't stopped to think about what it would do to our kids. I hadn't realized that by publicly humiliating Beth, I was also dragging them into this storm. At home, the atmosphere became unbearable. The once warm, lively house was now filled with tension and silence. The kids barely spoke to either of us. Beth moved through the days in a fog, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for their sake, but it was obvious that she was barely holding it together. And me? I had gotten what I wanted, or at least, what I thought I wanted. I had imagined that exposing Beth would give me closure, that it would make me feel better, vindicated somehow. But instead, I felt hollow. Every time I saw the pain in my kids' eyes, the awkward silence at the dinner table, the way Beth avoided looking at me, I realized that I had destroyed more than just her reputation. I had destroyed the fragile structure of our family. The kids weren't just Beth's victims, they were mine too. And that realization cut deeper than I ever thought it would. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself questioning everything. Yes, Beth had betrayed me. Yes, I had every right to be angry. But had I gone too far? I hadn't just exposed her affair. I had detonated a bomb in the middle of our lives, and now the wreckage was all around us. And the worst part was, I couldn't take any of it back. The consequences of my revenge had spiraled out of control. I had wanted justice, but all I had done was break the very thing I was trying to protect, our family. Now, as I watched the people I cared about the most struggle under the weight of what I had done, I began to wonder if this was a mistake I could ever truly fix. After the fundraiser, everything fell apart. The house, once filled with laughter, was now silent, tense. The kids barely spoke to me. Sarah, usually bright and chatty, avoided eye contact, and Jake, my oldest, shut himself in his room, ignoring me completely. It hit me that I hadn't just humiliated Beth, I had shattered our family. Beth stayed in the guest room. We barely exchanged words, and every time I saw her, I was reminded of the damage I'd caused. She had hurt me, yes, but I had taken it further than I ever should have. My need for revenge hadn't just hurt her, it had destroyed the safe space our kids once had. The satisfaction I thought I would feel was nowhere to be found. Instead, I was alone, surrounded by the consequences of my actions. One night, the weight of it all crashed down on me. I realized I had gone too far. Revenge hadn't healed anything, it had only deepened the pain. My children, who once looked up to me, were now distant and hurt, and I had no one to blame but myself. I knew I had to start making things right. I apologized to my children, telling them I had let my anger get the best of me, and that I regretted how I had handled everything. They didn't say much, but the fact that they listened was something. Facing Beth was harder. I found her late one night in the kitchen, looking drained. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, finally admitting what I had been avoiding. I wasn't just apologizing for what I did that night at the fundraiser, I was apologizing for letting everything spiral out of control. The damage was done, and I knew there was no easy way back. But I had to try. For the kids, for myself, and maybe, somehow, for what little was left of our family.